Hi.
Hello. We're in Acts 17. We've spent 2 segments there already, specifically on what is there. That is the emphasis. We've noted that the emphasis of the entire 10 verses is upon God. And his bottom line is that God will require an accounting of all men, but in order for all men to appear there for that accounting, God has to raise them from the dead, and he's appointed a man who he also rose from the raised from the dead, that he may be the judge on the day when all men are raised from the dead.
Right.
Well, that's not the message we had as Jehovah's Witnesses.
No.
In the second segment, we highlighted the fact that there's a lot of things you might not notice that aren't there in this message, at least 7 of them that we itemized.
Mm-hmm.
That's in the second segment. In this one, we wanted to emphasize one of those, which is the tetragram is not there. So let's look more closely at the divine designations that are in this message.
How does he designate God?
Starting with, of course, his jump-off point, or his entry point to the dialogue or the sermon would be when he saw an altar with the name "to an unknown God" on it. Mm-hmm. So he jumps on that in verse 24, and you find 2 of the titles of God designations in verse 24. First one.
Yeah. God that made the world, and the second one, Lord of heaven and earth.
And then there's not another one till you get down to verse 27.
27. Again, it's just God.
That they would seek God.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get to verse 29.
And it's children of God,
Children
or
of God.
progeny of God. And the divine being. So his being compared to not being like made of stone or silver or gold.
So that's 5 capitalized designations in the New World Translation of the Silver Sword.
And then
there's the last one in 30.
Yeah, God again. God has overlooked the times of ignorance.
So there are 6 divine designations capitalized in the New World Translation. Mm-hmm. No tetragram.
Yeah.
3 different ones. They are God, which is repeated
And
altogether 4 times.
There's no tetragram in the Watchtower's Bibles either.
Yeah, not in the New World Translation. So they've been unsuccessful in intruding the divine name into Paul's public message.
And he's speaking to Gentiles. There's a golden opportunity again.
So we have 6 divine designations that are official here. 4 of them are God, and there's 2 others, Lord of heaven and earth, and divine being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we also have 15 pronouns by my count. 15 pronouns, he or him.
Mm-hmm.
21 references to God in 10 verses.
And he never uses the divine name. So why would that be? And that is something we should think about. You were going to mention that they just recently, the Watchtower recently put out a telecast with why it should be in the Greek Testament.
Yes, again justifying their intruding the divine name 260 odd times in the New World Translation, New Testament. Mm-hmm. We all know that there's 7,000, almost 7,000 references to God by the name Yahweh or Jehovah, the Tetragram, in the Old Testament. But the Watchtower is unique in intruding this name so many times, at all really, among fairly well-used translations. In the New Testament, do they have any justification for it? And of course their logic, well, you can go to jw.org and follow their logic, but the point is, does Paul use it here? And if he doesn't, 21 references to God in 10 verses, no tetragram. What does that conform with?
Yeah. So he's following the pattern of the Old Testament. In that the Old Testament characters like Daniel and Joseph do not use the divine name when they're talking to Gentiles. So it makes perfect sense that here he's got an audience of Gentiles that are not in covenant relationship with God the way Israel was. And that's why Israel had that name. It was a special name for them.
When was it?
identify God.
When was it emphasized, that name? Well, if you just go back to the Book of Exodus, in your New World Translation, for that matter, the name starts to become prominent and starts to appear in the mouths of the patriarchs and the children of Israel at the Exodus, when God enters into a covenant relationship with Israel. And since we've already talked about this in numerous videos before. The Divine Names one, if you haven't seen that series, emphasizes this point. The name is covenant in that it connotes, in the original context, God's appearing, God's revealing himself visually, and God revealing himself by word. And that he uniquely did to Israel. That's another subject. But here I think suffice it to say that the pattern of Paul in the Areopagus conforms with Joseph in the book of Genesis, and Daniel throughout the entire book, except in the prayer, and Esther, and Ezra and Nehemiah, even in the Promised Land.
Right.
When they're talking to non-Jews, they avoid the divine name.
Paul is he uses God's name the way the Old Testament Jewish Israelites did.
The faithful one.
He's using it the same way, in that he doesn't use it when he's talking to Gentiles.
Yeah. Now, that might be the explanation as to why the name, the Tetragram, does not occur at all in the New Testament documents.
Yeah. And, why is this objectionable? Only because you're using the name like it's punctuation when you're a witness. It's not. That takes away from the specialness of the name. When it's just an arbitrary, well, we have to use it.
It's a brand, let's face it.
Yeah.
As several other commentators on XJW sites have already said, it's become a brand for Jehovah's Witnesses. That's why they feel they have to read it right into the New Testament. There's no justification.
It loses
for
its
that.
significance and its holiness. It's not revered, and it's just the flip side. So it's all from the angle you look at things.
So in a sense, it's a violation of the third commandment. I believe this is very significant, that there is a way to take the divine name in vain. And if you use it in context where holiness and fidelity and covenant are not part of what you mean by it, you're not using it legitimately.
A casual use
Yeah.
of the name.